right. Hello, everyone. My name is Maël. I'm super excited to be in front of you today to talk about a product and a topic that is more recent to Datadog, as opposed, for instance, to infrastructure monitoring. And this is the monitoring of user experience, or something that we could encompass into a broader term that is front-end observability. The agenda for today is very straightforward. First, we'll go through a brief introduction about front-end observability. Then we'll look at a couple of signals that you could leverage. And finally, I'll drive you through a real-life story that happened to us recently as a case study. All right, let's get started. From a workflow perspective, front-end observability isn't different from back-end one. You get signals that something's off. You investigate to understand the extent of the problem and pinpoint the root cause. Hopefully, you fix it. You monitor the fixes adoption, and you collaborate throughout the entire process. And actually, side note, front-end and back-end observability are progressively merging. Everyone who engaged with us in the past has already heard this a countless amount of time, but the single pane of glass is real. You can get all the data points from all the back-end services and front-end applications of your stack in one single place. And this lets you pivot between the different components of your stack, the different products, to turn individual and granular telemetry into a more complete and meaningful story. Maybe you're being notified about the memory of one of your hosts powering up your API service being quite low. And drilling down further and looking at the processes being run, you realize that the request rate for one of the most memory-intensive endpoint of your API is abnormally high. And pivoting back to your front-end applications, back to the surface, you realize that there was a recent deployment that introduced a regression on your maybe web and mobile applications, and that led to this front-end jamming your back-end. But from a signals perspective, many companies, and us included, still heavily leverage the good old escalation through support tickets and customer calls to get their observability, front-end observability signals. Maybe users are having troubles to do XYZ, and they're rightfully complaining to your support channels. Or maybe you're just discussing with one of your customers, and they're showing you how they're using your products, and you're realizing that they have an overtly complex pattern because your product might not be simple enough to use, or there might be some cumbersome ways to use it. And though nothing works better than a customer or a user being vocal about their pain points, actually proxies exist. Proxies exist to confront their feedback to quantitative data, find frustrations that users have not been vocal about yet, and measure the overall health of your front-end applications. Let's dive into those right away. At Datadog, we use our own real user monitoring product to measure our user experience and monitor the performance of our front-end applications, mobile and browser alike. If you're not familiar with this product, basically it collects a bunch of telemetry, performance, and behavioral ones from front-end applications. By telemetry, I mean, obviously, errors and crashes being preeminent in the model space, resources that are being fetched, including latency and a bunch of other data points, interactions from the users, the swipes, the clicks, the taps, and also including whenever users are being frustrated, when they're rage-clicking a button multiple times because nothing's happening on the screen. We're recording this. And a bunch of other telemetry, obviously. And because errors are often the most critical telemetry that we're getting and the first one that we're looking at, we're also using our error tracking product to turn these individual events into a more complete story. If you're not familiar with this, with error tracking on Datadog, basically it groups individual crashes and non-fatal errors together based on their similarity to help you triage and troubleshoot fewer higher-level issues instead of countless events that would be very hard to navigate. So when we talk about front-end observability, combining RAM and error tracking and setting up some monitors on top of this is usually a good place to start. If you're not familiar with monitors, hopefully you are, but it's a product on Datadog that lets you define scenarios that you want Datadog to alert you on when they happen. And as you might already know by now, at Datadog, we use heavily Datadog to monitor Datadog. Over the years, we figured out a pattern that works pretty well for us in terms of front-end observability. And at Datadog, every front-end team sets up at least 2 monitors to check out their pages. One that alerts every time that there is a new issue in error tracking happening on one of the views that the team owns. And another one that alerts the team every time that the issue affects more than n users, n depending on the importance of the view. Now, let's look at a story that happened to us recently. And here comes a tale of the translation bug. What I'm going to show in the next few slides really happened to us a couple of weeks ago, but for obvious confidentiality reasons, I could not give you a live tour of the product. So I did my best to create a photo commit out of screenshots, so hopefully you wouldn't get bored. Let's see how it goes. A couple of weeks ago, Monitor started ringing and posting notifications in our Slack channels. At first, looking at the errors that were happening, it didn't seem like an obvious case. The error message that we were getting failed to execute remove child on node, blah, 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 blah. And the stack trace seemed to be pointing at a problem in React and the way the framework handled components in the DOM. But looking at our code base, we tried to replicate the issue. We couldn't do it. It was not an obvious case. And since the amount of errors was pretty low, we decided to pause the investigation at this stage and wait for more data to come in. But the monitors kept ringing. So we had to investigate further and troubleshoot this problem. Looking at individual events, something caught our attention. They were all coming from few countries in particular. So looking typically at the geomap on Datadog that groups events based on the geography, it became obvious that the location of our users had something to do with the problem. But we're talking about front end, right? So I mean, what are our users seeing when the problem is happening? Since none of them had been vocal about the problem yet, could we learn something by rewatching their sessions? And here comes session replay. If you're not familiar with the product, it's a solution that records the behavioral events, like every swipe, every tap, every click, happening on your mobile application or brother application, so that you can afterwards replay the sessions of your users as if you were watching, as if you were looking over their shoulder. So we looked at some replay, and suddenly it all made sense. If you're not, if you haven't used Datadog, I mean, you should know this. We don't translate our UI. And we're not here to debate whether it's a good or a bad thing, but rather to ask a question. Why are we seeing things in Portuguese? It turns out that the way the browsers handle the translation, Chrome, Firefox, Safari, can break the React framework. Because, well, I won't go too much into detail, but basically when the browser translates, it changes the structure of the DOM, and React cannot necessarily reconcile afterwards the elements on the page with their reference, the reference that it has. In most cases, though it's not ideal, it's not fatal. But in some of them, where you have a piece of static text next to a dynamic one, the page can literally crash when users try to interact with a component that has been translated. And we're like any other companies out there, like, how good of a user experience is it to provide this to your users, especially when you are monitoring an observability solution and they're probably using your product to troubleshoot their own problems. So the fix was easy. And just implementing span tags around the dynamic text nodes did the trick. So I guess we can happily claim that the problem is solved right now. But I would like to leave you with 3 things in mind. The first one, telemetry does not only come from your backend services. Your front-end application produces data too. And actually, we've seen it together right now. There are problems, there are issues that are directly affecting your user experience that you can only encompass if you monitor your front-end applications. Second, at Datadog, we have a suite of products to help you out there. Real user monitoring to collect telemetry, error tracking to turn individual events into a more meaningful story, session replay to make the debugging and troubleshooting workflow more visual, but we could quite quote a bunch of others, like our synthetic suite of products for API, web, and mobile applications. And third, as any other Datadog product, they all connect and correlate to each other to turn individual telemetry into a complete story and make the single pane of glass that we like to talk about all the time real. Thank you very much. I hope it was insightful.